My name is Rachel Cooper, and I am 34 years old. As I stood beside my father's grave on that cold November morning, watching the last shovelful of earth seal away the man who had raised me, I couldn't have imagined that within the next hour, I would lose not just my father, but also discover the true face of the brother I'd grown up with. The rain that fell that day seemed fitting, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the death of David Cooper, a man whose kindness had extended far beyond bloodlines. The cemetery was crowded with mourners. My father had been well loved in our community, a successful construction company owner who had built not just buildings, but relationships that lasted decades. I recognized faces from all walks of his life, former employees who had become family friends, business associates whose children he'd mentored, neighbors who'd shared countless barbecues in our backyard. They all came to pay their respects to a man who had touched their lives in meaningful ways. I stood at the front, my black dress already soaked through despite the umbrella someone had thoughtfully held over me. My eyes were fixed on the mahogany casket that held the body of the only parent I'd truly known. David Cooper hadn't been my biological father, but he'd been more of a father to me than blood could ever guarantee. He'd taken me in when I was 5 years old, after my mother married him, and he'd never once made me feel like anything less than his true daughter. Beside me, my brother Matthew stood rigid and impatient. Even in grief, he couldn't hide his true nature. While I wept for the loss of our father, he kept checking his phone, his jaw tight with barely concealed irritation. At 37, Matthew had inherited our father's strong jaw and broad shoulders, but none of his warmth. Where David Cooper had been generous and kind, Matthew was calculating and cold. The distance between us at the graveside was more than physical. It was a chasm that had been growing wider for years. The minister's words washed over me in waves, sometimes penetrating my grief, sometimes bouncing off the wall of numbness I'd built around myself. David Cooper was a man who understood that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the love we choose to give. I caught those words and held them close, remembering all the times my father had said something similar to me, usually when Matthew had been particularly cruel about my adopted status. As the service concluded and people began to move away from the graveside, I noticed Harold Whitman, our family lawyer, standing near the back of the crowd. He'd been father's attorney for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to the family estate planning. The sight of him here wasn't surprising. What was surprising was the uncomfortable way he kept glancing between Matthew and me, as if he knew something we didn't. Matthew noticed him too. For the first time all day, I saw genuine emotion cross my brother's face, anticipation. He strode over to Harold before I could even process what was happening, gripping the older man's elbow and steering him toward the parking lot. Their hushed conversation made my skin crawl with unease. I was accepting condolences from Mrs. Henderson, my father's longtime secretary, when Matthew returned. His eyes held a gleam that I recognized from our childhood, the same look he'd get right before he'd frame me for something he'd done wrong. "Rachel," he said, his voice carrying a false note of concern that made my stomach turn. "Harold needs to speak with us. It's about Dad's estate." Today, I asked, incredulous, "We just buried him. Matthew, can't this wait?" His grip on my arm was firm as he guided me away from the remaining mourners. "Actually, it can't. There have been some recent changes that you need to be aware of." The walk to Harold's office felt surreal. The small law firm was only 3 blocks from the cemetery, housed in a building my father's company had renovated 5 years ago. I remembered visiting the construction site with him, watching him explain to his workers how important it was to preserve the historical details while modernizing the infrastructure. He'd been so proud of that project. Harold's office smelled of old leather and coffee, a combination that usually comforted me, but today made me nauseous. The older lawyer couldn't meet my eyes as he gestured for us to sit in the chairs across from his massive oak desk. Matthew sat immediately, leaning forward with eager attention. I remained standing. "I'm sorry to do this today." "Rachel," Harold began, his voice strained. But Matthew insisted, and legally, I'm obligated to inform all beneficiaries of the will's contents as soon as possible, after the death. What do you mean, recent changes? I asked, though something cold was already settling in my chest. Harold pulled out a document from his desk drawer, his hands trembling slightly. Your father came to see me 2 weeks ago. He was agitated. He insisted on making changes to his will. 2 weeks ago, I'd been in Seattle on business, managing one of our company's projects. Matthew had volunteered to stay with Dad, who had been recovering from what we thought was a mild stroke. The doctors had said he was doing well, that with rest and care, he'd make a full recovery. Instead, he'd had a massive stroke 5 days later that killed him instantly. What kind of changes? My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else. Harold cleared his throat and began reading. The legal language washed over me, but the meaning was crystal clear. Everything, the house, the company, the investments, all of it had been left to Matthew. To me. My father had left only what the will described as personal items of sentimental value, his fishing gear. Some books we'd read together, photo albums. The room spun. I gripped the back of the chair to steady myself, my mind refusing to process what I was hearing. This couldn't be right. My father had always promised that he'd take care of me, that blood didn't matter, that I was as much his daughter as Matthew was his son. I don't understand, I whispered. Matthew's voice cut through my shock like a blade. It's quite simple, really. Dad finally came to his senses. Blood is blood. Rachel, you were always just the baggage that came with Mom. Now that they're both gone, it's time you faced reality. I looked at him then, really looked at him, my brother, the boy I'd grown up with, who I'd helped with homework and covered for when he'd snuck out as a teenager. The man who'd been too busy to visit when Mom was dying of cancer, who'd missed her funeral because of a crucial business meeting, who'd only shown up now because there was something in it for him. Dad wouldn't do this, I said, my voice stronger now. He loved me. He loved you. Matthew laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. He tolerated you. There's a difference. But in the end, when it really mattered, he knew who his real family was. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Rachel, I know this is difficult. Your father did express that he wanted you to have the personal items specifically because of their sentimental value. He mentioned that you would understand their importance. I barely heard him. My mind was racing through memories, Dad teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway, staying up late to help me with my science fair project, walking me down the aisle at my college graduation because I'd asked him to. The man who'd done all that wouldn't just abandon me like this. When exactly did he make these changes? I asked Harold. Tuesday, November 3rd, at approximately 2 p.m. Harold replied, consulting his notes. I pulled out my phone, checking my calendar. I'd been in Seattle from November 1st to November 5th. Matthew had been alone with Dad for 4 days. Was he of sound mind? I pressed. You said he was agitated. Was he capable of making this decision? Harold's discomfort increased visibly. He appeared to be lucid. Yes, he knew what he was doing. Appeared to be, I repeated. But you weren't sure. Rachel, stop. Matthew interjected, his voice sharp. It's done. Dad made his choice. The sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be. I turned to face him fully. When do you want me out of the house? For just a moment, I saw surprise flicker across his face. He'd expected me to fight, to rage, to break down. Instead, I was calm, controlled. It unsettled him. I'll give you a week to pack your things, he said, recovering his composure. And only your things. Everything in that house belongs to the estate now. My estate. I nodded once, turned on my heel, and walked out of the office without another word. Behind me, I heard Matthew say something to Harold, but I didn't care what it was. I had more important things to focus on. The drive back to the house, I couldn't think of it as home anymore, was a blur. My mind wasn't on the road, but on the past, sifting through memories like an investigator looking for clues. The more I thought about it, the more wrong everything felt. Dad had been different in the weeks leading up to his first stroke, but I'd attributed it to stress about the business. He'd been worried about a particular project, Something about the financing falling through. Matthew had offered to help, to use his connections in the financial world to secure new funding. Dad had been hesitant at first. He'd never fully trusted Matthew's business practices, but eventually, he'd agreed. That was 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks during which Matthew had been unusually present, unusually helpful. 6 weeks during which he'd gradually inserted himself into more and more of Dad's affairs. I'd been grateful at the time, thinking that maybe Matthew was finally stepping up, finally being the son Dad had always hoped he'd be. Now, sitting in the driveway of the house I'd called home for almost 30 years, I saw it differently. Matthew hadn't been helping, he'd been positioning himself. The house stood before me, a beautiful Victorian that Dad had restored himself in the early days of his construction company. Every detail had been a labor of love, from the hand-carved banisters to the stained glass windows he'd commissioned from a local artist. This house had been his pride and joy, the place where he'd built his family. I walked through the front door, each step echoing in the sudden emptiness. The house felt different already, as if it knew its true owner was gone and the pretender was about to take his place. I moved through the rooms slowly, remembering. Here was where Mom had taught me to play piano. There was where Dad had built a blanket fort with me during a thunderstorm when I was 7. The kitchen where we'd baked cookies every Christmas, flour everywhere, Mom laughing at Dad's terrible decorating skills. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I was here for answers. Dad's study was exactly as he'd left it. Matthew hadn't been in here yet. I could tell by the way everything was still perfectly arranged according to Dad's particular system. His reading glasses sat on top of an open book, a biography of Theodore Roosevelt he'd been working through. His fountain pen lay beside a half-written letter. I picked up the letter, recognizing his careful handwriting. My dearest Rachel, it began. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me before I could explain everything properly. There are things you need to know, things I should have told you years ago, but kept putting off because I thought we had more time. We always think we have more time. The letter ended there, mid-sentence, as if he'd been interrupted. I searched the desk for more, but found nothing. Whatever he'd wanted to tell me, he'd taken it to his grave. But Dad was nothing if not thorough. He'd been a planner, a man who believed in backup plans for backup plans. If he'd wanted to tell me something important, he wouldn't have relied on just one letter. I spent the next 3 hours systematically searching his study. I went through every drawer, checked behind every book, looked for any hiding spots he might have used. Dad had been paranoid about important documents, a quirk that Mom had always teased him about. He'd had a safe, of course, but Matthew had already claimed that, saying all the contents were related to the business. It was nearly midnight when I found it. Hidden inside the false bottom of an old tackle box, one of the personal items of sentimental value I was allowed to take, was a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I opened it. The first entry was dated 6 weeks ago, right around the time Matthew had started helping with the business. Something's wrong. Matthew's sudden interest in the company feels calculated. He's asking questions about the will, about the corporate structure, about things he's never cared about before. I want to believe he's finally maturing, finally ready to be part of the family business. But my instincts tell me otherwise. I've decided to start documenting our interactions, just in case. I read through entry after entry, each one painting a picture that made my blood run cold. Dad had documented everything: Matthew's questions about the will, his suggestions about updating the estate planning, his increasingly aggressive attempts to gain control of the company. But more than that, Dad had documented his own failing health. The headaches are getting worse. Sometimes I can't think clearly. Matthew says it's just stress, that I'm working too hard. He's been making me tea in the evenings, says it will help me relax. But I feel worse after drinking it, not better. Paranoid thought, what if it's not meant to help? My hands clenched around the journal. Dad hadn't had a stroke because of natural causes. He'd had a stroke because someone had been slowly poisoning him. The entries became more sporadic as Dad's health declined. His handwriting, usually so precise, became shaky and uncertain. But one entry, dated the day before he'd changed his will, was different. The handwriting was Dad's, but it was forced, as if someone had been guiding his hand. I've decided to leave everything to Matthew. He is my son by blood, and blood matters. Rachel will understand. She was never really mine anyway. Those weren't Dad's words. In 30 years, he'd never once referred to Matthew as his son by blood, or suggested that I wasn't really his. This was Matthew's language, Matthew's sentiment, forced through Dad's pen. The last entry was dated the day before Dad's death. The handwriting was barely legible, but the words were clear. Rachel, my true daughter, forgive me. I wasn't strong enough to fight him. But I've made arrangements. Trust Harold's partner, not Harold. Look for the cardinal's nest. You were always better at finding them than Matthew. Remember, family isn't blood, it's choice, and I choose you. Always have, always will. I sat back. The journal clutched to my chest. The cardinal's nest? When I was young, Dad and I would go bird watching in the backyard. I had a talent for spotting the bright red cardinals and their carefully hidden nests. Matthew had never had the patience for it, always scaring the birds away with his noise and movement. There was an old oak tree in the backyard with a birdhouse Dad and I had built together when I was 10. It had been designed specifically to attract cardinals, though they'd never actually nested in it, preferring the natural branches of the tree itself. I slipped out the back door, grateful for the full moon that lit my way. The oak tree stood sentinel at the back of the property, its branches reaching toward the stars. The birdhouse was still there, weathered but intact. I reached inside, my fingers searching for something, anything. There. A small metal key taped to the inside roof of the birdhouse. I pulled it free, recognizing it immediately. It was the key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank, but not the one Dad had officially maintained for the business. This was something else, something secret. I pocketed the key and the journal, then went back inside to continue my search. If Dad had left me clues, I needed to find them all before Matthew took possession of the house. But as I entered the kitchen, I heard a car in the driveway. Matthew wasn't supposed to be here. He'd said he was staying at his condo downtown, that he wouldn't move in until I was gone. I quickly grabbed a few more of the sentimental items Harold had mentioned, photo albums, Dad's fishing gear, his favorite books, and loaded them into my car. As I was closing the trunk, Matthew appeared on the front porch. Couldn't sleep either, he asked, but there was suspicion in his voice. Just collecting some of my things, I replied evenly. Didn't want to do it during the day. Too many memories. He studied me for a long moment, and I forced myself to look broken, defeated. It wasn't hard, part of me genuinely was, but another part, a part that was very much David Cooper's daughter, was beginning to burn with cold determination. Don't take anything that isn't specifically listed in the will, he warned. Just Dad's fishing stuff and some photos, I said, gesturing to my car. Nothing you'd want anyway. He sneered. No, I suppose not. Hurry up and get the rest of your things. I'm having the locks changed on Monday. I nodded meekly and drove away, leaving him standing on the porch of the house that had been my home. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't defeated. I was David Cooper's daughter, and I was going to find out exactly what Matthew had done to our father. The next morning, I was at First National Bank when they opened. The safety deposit box was registered under a name I didn't recognize, Cardinal Properties, LLC, but the key fit. And what I found inside changed everything. There were documents, dozens of them. Corporation papers showing that Dad had transferred 60% of Cooper Construction to Cardinal Properties LLC 6 months ago, long before his health had started failing. The LLC's sole beneficiary was listed as Rachel Ann Cooper, me. There were also USB drives, labeled with dates. I pocketed them, along with a thick manila envelope marked, for Rachel, open only in case of emergency. I considered this an emergency. Back in my car, I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from Dad, this one complete and dated 8 months ago. My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. I've suspected for some time that Matthew is not the son I hoped he would become. His jealousy of you has festered into something darker, something dangerous. I've taken steps to protect you and the company, but I need you to understand why. Cooper Construction was never just about building structures. It was about building community, providing good jobs, creating something that would last beyond us. You understand this. You've always understood this. Matthew sees only dollar signs and opportunities for exploitation. I've watched him these past years, hoping he would change, hoping he would see what truly matters. But people don't change, Rachel. They just become more of who they always were. And Matthew has always been someone who takes rather than gives. The company is yours, my daughter. Not because of any legal document, but because you embody everything it represents. You've worked alongside our crews, you know every employee's name, you understand that success is measured not just in profits but in the lives we improve. I've made the legal arrangements to ensure this. But Matthew is cunning. He may try to manipulate me, especially if my health fails. I've been having headaches lately, moments of confusion. Perhaps I'm just getting old. Or perhaps, well, paranoia runs in the Cooper family, as you know. If something happens to me, trust Robert Hartley at Hartley & Associates. He has copies of all the real documents. Harold Whitman is a good man, but he has gambling debts that make him vulnerable to pressure. I've kept him as the family lawyer to avoid suspicion, but the real work has been done elsewhere. The USB drives contain recordings of my meetings with Matthew over the past year. Listen to them. You'll understand why I've taken these precautions. There's also video from the security system I had installed in my home office, the one Matthew doesn't know about. Be careful, my daughter. Be smart. And remember, you are more my child than Matthew ever was. Biology is just genetics. Family is choice. And I chose you the day your mother brought you into my life. All my love, Dad. I sat in my car for a long time, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, but of rage. Matthew hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd stolen my father's last months of life. Poisoned him, manipulated him, used his weakness against him. And for what money property things that Dad had already insured would be mine. But I couldn't act on emotion. Dad had taught me better than that. In construction, he used to say, you measure twice and cut once. Same applies to life. Think it through, plan it out, then execute flawlessly. I drove to a hotel on the other side of town, one Matthew wouldn't think to look for me in. I needed time to review everything, to build my case. The USB drives revealed a treasure trove of evidence. Hours of recorded conversations where Matthew pressured Dad about the will, tried to convince him that I wasn't real family, that the company should stay in the bloodline. But it was the video files that were truly damning. The hidden camera in Dad's office had captured everything, including Matthew slipping something into Dad's tea on multiple occasions. It had captured Dad's increasing confusion, his moments of disorientation. And most crucially, it had captured the day Dad changed his will. The video showed Matthew standing over Dad, guiding his hand as he signed the documents. Dad's eyes were unfocused, his movements sluggish. At one point, he tried to pull away, mumbling something about Rachel. But Matthew's grip on his hand was firm. Just sign it. Dad! Matthew's voice was cold and commanding. You're not thinking clearly. This is what's best for everyone. Rachel, Dad mumbled again. Rachel was never really your daughter, Matthew said, his voice dripping with venom. She was just Mom's bastard that you were too soft to turn away. I'm your son, your only real child. It's time you remembered that. The video also showed Harold Whitman in the room, looking deeply uncomfortable, but saying nothing. At one point, Matthew handed him an envelope, thick with what was obviously cash. Harold pocketed it without counting, his face a mask of shame. I had enough evidence to destroy Matthew, but I needed to be strategic. Going to the police with accusations of poisoning would require proof that Dad had actually been poisoned, and his body had already been cremated. At Matthew's insistence, I now realized. But the financial manipulation, the forged will, the coercion, those I could prove. My first stop was Robert Hartley's office. Unlike Harold Whitman's traditional setup, Hartley and Associates occupied a modern building downtown. Robert himself was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Ms. Cooper," he said, standing as I entered. "I've been expecting you. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man." "You knew him well." "He was my first client when I started my practice 10 years ago. Took a chance on a young lawyer when nobody else would. I owed him everything." His voice carried genuine grief. "Please, sit. We have a lot to discuss." Over the next 2 hours, Robert laid out the full scope of what Dad had done to protect the company and me. It was masterful in its complexity. The 60% transfer to Cardinal Properties was ironclad, done months before any potential undue influence. The remaining 40% was structured in a trust that required board approval for any major decisions. And Dad had stacked the board with longtime employees who were loyal to the company's mission. And to me, "Your father knew Matthew would try something," Robert explained. "He said Matthew had been asking too many questions, showing too much interest in things he'd never cared about before. So we created a structure that would protect the company even if Matthew managed to manipulate the will." "But Harold said the will supersedes everything," I protested. Robert smiled grimly. "Harold said what he was paid to say. But a will can't supersede corporate documents that were filed months earlier. Cardinal Properties LLC owns 60% of Cooper Construction, and you own Cardinal Properties. It's that simple. So Matthew gets nothing. Oh, he gets what the will says he gets. The house, the personal bank accounts, the cars, about $2 million in total assets. But the company, the real value of your father's estate, that was never part of the will to begin with." I showed Robert the videos, the evidence of Matthew's manipulation. His face darkened as he watched. "This is criminal," he said. "Coercion, elder abuse, possibly more. We need to take this to the authorities." "Not yet," I said. "First, I want to secure the company. Matthew doesn't know about Cardinal Properties yet. Let's keep it that way until we're ready." Robert nodded slowly. "Your father always said you had a strategic mind. What do you have in mind?" I thought about it carefully. Matthew believed he'd won. He thought he had everything. That arrogance would be his downfall. "Schedule a board meeting for Monday," I said. "Don't notify Matthew. As far as he knows, he's inheriting everything and the board will just rubber stamp his takeover. Let him walk in thinking he's king. And then we show him who really owns the kingdom." The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation. I met quietly with key employees, the ones who had been with Dad the longest, Maria Santos, the head of operations who Dad had hired when she was fresh out of college 20 years ago. James Wright, the chief foreman who had started as a laborer and worked his way up. Susan Liu, the CFO who had helped Dad grow the company from a small operation to a multi-million-dollar business. Each of them had stories about Matthew's recent behavior, his attempts to go around Dad and make deals that would have compromised the company's values. They were relieved to learn that I would be taking over, not him. "Your father built something special here," Maria told me over coffee. "We're not just a construction company, we're a family." Matthew never understood that. I also met with Detective Amanda Price, a friend from college who had gone into law enforcement. I showed her the evidence, asked for her advice. "The poisoning would be hard to prove without a body," she admitted. "But the financial crimes, the elder abuse, the coercion, those we can definitely pursue. Give me a few days to dig into this quietly." A Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood. I dressed carefully in my best business suit, the one Dad had bought me when I'd landed my first big project manager role. "Dress like the person you want to be," he'd said, "and eventually, you'll become them." The Cooper Construction headquarters occupied a building Dad had built 15 years ago, a testament to sustainable design and quality craftsmanship. I arrived early, using my key card to enter. Matthew hadn't thought to deactivate it yet. The security guard, Thomas, gave me a sad smile. "Good to see you, Ms. Rachel. We've all been worried about you." "Thank you, Thomas," Is the boardroom set up for the meeting? Yes, ma'am. Mr. Robert said to expect about 15 people. I made my way to the boardroom, taking my place not at the head of the table, that was still Dad's spot in my mind, but to the right, where I'd always sat during the meetings Dad had invited me to attend. The board members filed in one by one, each offering condolences and support. These were people who had helped build the company, who understood its values and mission. They were also people who had watched me grow up, who had seen me work my way up from filing papers as a teenager to managing multi-million-dollar projects. At precisely 9 a.m., Matthew strode in with Harold Whitman in tow. The smile on his face faltered when he saw the room already full. "What is this?" he demanded. "I didn't call a board meeting." "No," I said calmly. "I did." "You have no authority to call board meetings," he sputtered. "I own this company now." "Actually," Robert Hartley said, entering the room with a stack of documents. "That's what we're here to discuss. If you'll take a seat, Mr. Cooper, we can begin." Matthew remained standing. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, Rachel, but it's over. Dad left everything to me. Tell them." Harold. Harold looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "The will does state." "The will is irrelevant to this discussion." Robert interrupted smoothly. "We're here to discuss the ownership and management of Cooper Construction, which is a separate matter from Mr. David Cooper's personal estate." He began distributing documents around the table. 6 months ago, David Cooper transferred 60% ownership of Cooper Construction to Cardinal Properties LLC, with Rachel Cooper as the sole beneficiary. This transfer was properly documented, filed, and is irrevocable. The blood drained from Matthew's face. "That's impossible. Dad wouldn't." "Furthermore," Robert continued, "the remaining 40% is held in a trust with specific provisions for governance. Major decisions require board approval, and the board composition cannot be changed without unanimous consent of all members." "This is fraud," Matthew shouted. Dad wasn't in his right mind. He was sick, confused. "Any documents he signed?" "Were signed 6 months ago," I said quietly, "when he was perfectly healthy, before you started poisoning him." The room went silent. Matthew's face cycled through emotions, shock, rage, fear, before settling on denial. "You can't prove that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out a laptop and connected it to the room's display system. "Actually, I can." The first video showed Matthew researching undetectable poisons on his laptop. Dad's hidden camera had captured it all. The second showed him purchasing substances online. The third, and most damning, showed him adding those substances to Dad's tea, night after night. "You killed him," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning inside me. "You slowly poisoned our father because you wanted his money. And when that wasn't working fast enough, you coerced him into changing his will while he was incapacitated." The board members watched in horrified silence as the evidence played out on the screen. Harold Whitman had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead. I didn't know," Harold stammered. "He said David wanted to change the will. I thought—" "You thought $5,000 in cash was worth selling your integrity." I finished for him. "We have that on video too." Matthew lunged for the laptop, but James Wright, still strong despite his 60 years, restrained him easily. "It's over." "Matthew," I said. "Detective Price is waiting outside with a warrant for your arrest. Fraud, elder abuse, coercion, and suspicion of murder. You're going to prison for a very long time." As if on cue, Amanda entered with 2 uniformed officers. Matthew's face contorted with rage as they cuffed him. "You were never his real daughter," he screamed as they dragged him toward the door. "You were nothing, just some bastard he felt sorry for. I'm his blood, I'm his son." I stood, meeting his wild eyes with calm determination. "Dad used to say that family isn't about blood, it's about choice. He chose me, Matthew. Every day for 29 years, he chose me. And in the end, he made sure his choice would stand, no matter what you did to him. They took him away, his screams echoing down the hallway until the elevator doors finally cut them off. Harold slumped in his chair, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "I'll be disbarred," he whispered. "Yes," I agreed. "You will. You'll also be charged as an accessory. But if you cooperate fully with the investigation, maybe you'll avoid prison." He nodded miserably, understanding that his career, his reputation, everything he'd built over decades had been destroyed for $5,000. The board meeting continued after the police left. There were formalities to observe, votes to take. I was unanimously elected as the new CEO of Cooper Construction, effective immediately. But when it came time to take Dad's seat at the head of the table, I hesitated. "That was his chair," I said softly. Maria Santos stood and walked over to me, putting a gentle hand on my shoulder. "And now it's yours. He would want you to take it. Rachel, you're not replacing him. You're continuing what he started." I sat down slowly, the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. But it wasn't a burden. It was a gift. One last present from the man who had chosen to be my father. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and company transitions. Matthew was charged with multiple felonies. The investigation revealed he'd been planning this for over a year, researching poisons, studying Dad's habits, slowly working his way into position. His laptop contained detailed notes about his plans, including his intention to sell the company to developers who would have dismantled everything Dad had built. Harold Whitman was disbarred and charged as an accessory after the fact. He pled guilty and received 2 years probation in exchange for his testimony. He sent me a letter of apology that I never answered. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. I moved the company forward, honoring Dad's vision while adapting to new challenges. We expanded our community outreach programs, increased employee benefits, and took on projects that made a difference, not just a profit. The company thrived under collective leadership, proving that Dad's values were the foundation of our success, not just his presence. The house was a different matter. Legally, it belonged to Matthew. But with his assets frozen pending trial, it sat empty. I could have fought for it, proved that it was purchased with company funds and should have been corporate property, but I didn't want it. Not anymore. That house held too many memories, both beautiful and terrible. Instead, I suggested to the board that we purchase it from Matthew's estate once the legal proceedings were finished. We could turn it into a community center, a place where kids from the neighborhood could come for after-school programs, where seniors could gather for activities. Dad would have liked that. I kept only the things that mattered. The photo albums showed our family through the years, Mom teaching me piano, Dad and I fishing. Family vacations where Matthew sulked in the background while the rest of us laughed. The fishing gear still smelled like the lake where Dad and I spent countless Saturday mornings, more interested in talking than catching anything. His books, margins filled with his careful notes, thoughts he'd wanted to share with me someday. One book in particular caught my attention. It was his copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, worn from multiple readings. Inside the front cover, he'd written, "For Rachel, who understands that real courage is when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what. All my love, Dad." The date on the inscription was just a week before he died. He'd known what was coming. He'd known Matthew would win the immediate battle, but he'd also known I'd see it through, that I'd fight for what was right even when it seemed hopeless. Late one evening, about 3 months after the funeral, I found myself in Dad's office at the company. I'd had it preserved exactly as he'd left it, though I conducted business from my own space down the hall. Sometimes I just needed to sit there, to feel close to him. I was going through his desk, looking for a contract template, when I found one last letter. It was sealed, my name written across the front in his careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated the day before his death. My dearest Rachel, by the time you read this, you'll have discovered the truth about Matthew. You'll have secured the company and ensured our employees' futures. You'll have honored my memory by being exactly who you are, my daughter in every way that matters. I write this with a clear mind. Though my body is failing, Matthew thinks he's won, but he never understood what victory really means. He sees only the material, never the spiritual. He wants the kingdom, but doesn't understand that the kingdom was never mine to give. It was built by all of us, together. And it belongs to those who understand its true purpose. You asked me once why I never forced you to call me Dad when you first came to live with us. Do you remember you were 6 and very serious? And you wanted to know why I didn't insist like your friend Jenny's stepfather did. I told you then that the best things in life can't be forced. They have to be chosen. You chose to call me Dad when you were 7. It was a Tuesday. You'd fallen off your bike and scraped your knee badly. I was cleaning the wound, and you were trying not to cry. Suddenly you said, "It's okay, Dad, I'm brave like you." That was the moment you became my daughter. Not when your mother and I married, not when the adoption papers were signed. That Tuesday afternoon when you chose me. Matthew is my son by birth, but he never chose to be my son in spirit. He never understood that love multiplies when shared, that there was more than enough for both of you. His jealousy poisoned him long before he thought to poison me. Don't waste time on hatred. My daughter. Matthew will face justice, both legal and cosmic. Focus instead on what we built together. Take care of our people. Build things that matter. Create opportunities for others to choose their own families, their own futures. And remember, always, that you were chosen. Every day of your life with us, you were chosen. By your mother, who brought you into my life. By me, who thanked God for the gift of you. And by yourself, every time you chose to be part of our family, despite Matthew's cruelty. The company is yours because you understand what it represents. The legacy is yours because you embody it. But most importantly, my love is yours because you earned it, not through blood or obligation, but through the million small choices that make a family. Be happy, my daughter. Be strong. Be yourself. That's all I ever wanted for you. With all my love. Dad. P.S. Check the tackle box again. Under the false bottom's false bottom, some treasures are worth hiding twice. I was crying so hard I could barely see, but I managed to drive home and retrieve the tackle box. Under the false bottom I'd already discovered was another compartment, this one containing a small velvet box. Inside was Mom's engagement ring, the one I thought had been buried with her. A note was wrapped around the ring box. She wanted you to have this, said you'd know when the time was right to wear it. Not as an engagement ring, necessarily, but as a reminder that love comes in many forms, and the best love is always a choice. I slipped the ring onto my right hand, where it caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the room. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The trial began 6 months after Dad's death. By then, the media had picked up the story. Brother poisons father for inheritance, sister fights back, made for sensational headlines. I refused all interview requests, letting the evidence speak for itself. Matthew's defense team tried everything. They claimed the videos were fake, that I had manipulated Dad into transferring the company, that I was the one who had poisoned him to frame Matthew, but the evidence was overwhelming. The poison found in Matthew's apartment matched the toxins in Dad's system. His financial records showed suspicious purchases, his own notes, which he'd foolishly kept, detailed his plans. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. 25 to life for murder in the first degree, plus additional time for fraud and elder abuse. When they read the verdict, Matthew didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the table, perhaps finally understanding that his choices had consequences. I thought I'd feel satisfaction at his conviction, but mostly I felt empty. Justice had been served, but it wouldn't bring Dad back. It wouldn't restore the family we might have been if Matthew had chosen differently. After the trial, I had one last task to complete. I drove to the cemetery where both my parents were buried, Dad's ashes interred next to Mom's grave as he'd requested. I brought fresh flowers, cardinal red roses for Mom, and yellow sunflowers for Dad. He's gone, I told them, though I knew they couldn't hear me. Matthew's gone, and he's not coming back. The company is safe. Your legacy is secure. I did what you taught me to do. I stood up for what was right, even when it hurt. I sat there for a long time, talking to them about the company, about my plans for the future, about the community center we were building in their honor. I told them about the young woman I'd just hired who reminded me of myself at that age, eager, smart, but lacking confidence. I was mentoring her the way Dad had mentored me. I'm choosing her, I said, understanding finally what Dad had meant. The way you chose me, the way we choose our families not through blood, but through love. As I stood to leave, a cardinal landed on Dad's headstone. It tilted its head at me, chirped once, then flew away. I chose to take it as a sign, though Dad would have laughed at my sentimentality. Birds are birds, Rachel, he would have said, but with that twinkle in his eye that meant he didn't quite believe it himself. I walked back to my car, Mom's ring catching the light on my hand. Behind me, the graves of my parents lay peaceful in the afternoon sun. Ahead of me stretched a future they had made possible through their love, their sacrifice, and their trust in me. The drive back to the office was familiar now. 6 months as CEO had given me confidence in the role, though I still sometimes expected to see Dad coming around the corner, coffee in hand, ready to discuss the day's projects. The employees had embraced my leadership, especially after Matthew's trial revealed how close we'd come to losing everything we'd built together. That evening, I called together the senior staff for our weekly meeting. We discussed ongoing projects, reviewed financial reports, celebrated successes, normal business, the kind Dad had conducted for decades. But at the end, I had an announcement. I've been thinking about Dad's vision for this company. I began. He always said we were more than just a construction firm. We were community builders. I want to expand on that vision. I outlined my plan, a nonprofit arm of the company dedicated to building affordable housing, training young people in construction trades, providing second chances to those who needed them. We'd fund it with a percentage of our profits, ensuring that our success directly translated into community benefit. What would we call it? Maria asked, already on board with the idea. I smiled. The David Cooper Foundation. Tagline, building families, one choice at a time. The vote was unanimous. Dad would have pretended to grumble about the sentimentality of naming it after him, but I knew he would have been proud. This was his true legacy, not the buildings we'd erected, but the lives we'd touched and would continue to touch. As the meeting broke up, Susan Liu lingered behind. You know, your father talked about something like this years ago, but he said the timing wasn't right. The company wasn't ready. I think he was waiting for you. Waiting for me. To be ready to lead it. He knew Matthew would never understand. But you were always the one who got it, who understood that success meant lifting others up, not stepping on them. That night, I worked late in Dad's office, my office now, though I still thought of it as his. I was reviewing applications for the Foundation's first project when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Hello? Is this Rachel Cooper? The voice was young, female, nervous. Yes, who is this? My name is Jennifer Chen. I'm Matthew's daughter. The words hit me like a physical blow. Matthew had a daughter. In all the years, he'd never mentioned a child. I sank into Dad's chair, trying to process this information. I didn't know Matthew had a daughter, I said carefully. He doesn't acknowledge me, Jennifer said, her voice bitter. My mom had a brief relationship with him 5 years ago. When she got pregnant, he paid her to go away, to never contact him again. But I've been following the trial. I know what he did to your father. To our grandfather. Our grandfather. The words hung in the air between us, complicated and painful. What do you want, Jennifer? I don't want money, she said quickly. I don't want anything from him. But I hoped, maybe I could meet you. My mom says I'm nothing like him. She says I remind her of the man she's seen in the news, David Cooper, kind, generous, the kind of person who would take in a child who wasn't his blood and love her like his own. I closed my eyes, hearing Dad's voice in my memory. Family is chosen, Rachel, every time. How old are you, Jennifer? 18. I just started college, pre-law. I want to help people who can't defend themselves. People like your father when he was sick and Matthew was. She trailed off. Where are you going to school? State University. I have a partial scholarship, but I'm working 2 jobs to cover the rest. I made a decision then, one I knew Dad would have made. Jennifer, how would you like to apply for the David Cooper Foundation Scholarship Program? We're just starting it. Aimed at students who want to make a difference in their communities. Full tuition, plus a mentorship with one of our senior staff. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then I heard her crying. You don't even know me, she whispered. I could be lying. I could be just like him. But you're not, I said. Someone just like him wouldn't have called, wouldn't have cared about making things right. You're choosing to be different, to be better. That's what matters. We arranged to meet that weekend. Jennifer looked nothing like Matthew. She had her mother's delicate features and kind eyes. But when she smiled, I saw a flash of Dad in her expression. Not biological inheritance, but something deeper. The capacity for kindness that Matthew had rejected, but that lived on in spite of him. Over coffee. She told me her story. Her mother had been a junior architect at a firm Matthew's company had worked with. He'd pursued her relentlessly, then dropped her the moment she became inconvenient. Jennifer had grown up knowing her father's name, but nothing else about him. Mom never said anything bad about him. Jennifer said, she just said he wasn't ready to be a father. But I researched him. I know what kind of man he is. Was. And when I learned about David Cooper, about the kind of man who raised you, I wished. What did you wish? I wished I could have known him, that he could have been my grandfather for real. Mom says that's silly, that you can't choose your family. But that's not true. Is it David Cooper chose you? And you're choosing to help me. That's family. I thought about Matthew in his prison cell, about the choices he'd made and the legacy he'd created. Then I thought about this young woman, choosing to be better, choosing to break the cycle. Would you like to see the company? I asked. Learn about what we do. Her eyes lit up. Really, you'd do that? Dad always said the best way to understand someone was to see what they built. Come on. Let me show you what your grandfather created. We spent the afternoon touring construction sites, meeting employees, discussing the foundation's plans. Jennifer absorbed everything with an intensity that reminded me of myself at her age. When we visited the community center being built in my parents' house, she stood in what had been Dad's study, tears in her eyes. He died here, she asked softly. He lived here, I corrected. This is where he worked, where he planned, where he built a legacy that will outlast us all. And now it's going to be a place where kids who need chances will get them, where families of choice can form. I wish I could have met him. I put my hand on her shoulder. You are meeting him. Every person whose life he touched carries a piece of him forward. The kindness he showed, the chances he gave, the family he chose, that's all still here, still growing. 6 months later, Jennifer spoke at the first David Cooper Foundation scholarship ceremony. She talked about chances, about choosing to be better than your circumstances, about the man she'd never met but whose legacy had changed her life. David Cooper understood that family isn't about blood, she said, her voice strong and clear. It's about choice, every day. We choose whether to build walls or bridges, whether to lift others up or tear them down. Today, 25 students are getting the chance to choose a better future. That's David Cooper's true inheritance, not money or property, but opportunity. The chance to choose who we become. Matthew never responded to the letters Jennifer sent him in prison, but she kept writing, telling him about her life, her studies, her work with the foundation. Not because she expected him to change, but because she was choosing to be the kind of person who didn't give up on family, even when they'd given up on themselves. I often think about that day at the cemetery, when Matthew took everything he thought mattered and left me with what he considered worthless. He got the money, the house, the trappings of success, but I got Dad's true legacy. The understanding that wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch, the families you build, the choices you make. The company thrived under employee ownership, with me as CEO, but decisions made collectively. We became known not just for quality construction, but for community investment. Every project included local hiring, training programs, and community benefit agreements. We built homeless shelters and hospitals, schools and senior centers. We built futures. The foundation grew beyond anything I'd imagined. What started as a single scholarship program expanded into job training, addiction recovery support, family counseling services. We helped former prisoners re-enter society, gave teenagers aging out of foster care the families they'd never had, provided resources for grandparents raising grandchildren. We built families of choice, one relationship at a time. On the 5th anniversary of Dad's death, we held a memorial at the community center. Hundreds of people came, employees, community members, scholarship recipients, people whose lives had been touched by his legacy. Jennifer gave a speech about the grandfather she'd found after his death, the family that had chosen her when her blood family wouldn't. I stood in what had been Dad's study, now a library where kids did homework and adults learned to read. The walls were covered with photos, not just of our family, but of all the families that had formed here. Chosen families, built families, real families. "You did it, Dad," I whispered to his photo on the wall. "You showed us how to build something that lasts." As the event wound down, I found myself in the backyard by the old oak tree. The birdhouse we'd built still hung there, weathered but intact. As I watched, a cardinal landed on its perch, pecked at the entrance, then flew away. I thought about Matthew, serving his life sentence, holding on to his bitterness like the bars that held him. He'd wanted so desperately to be Dad's only heir, to claim the bloodline as his sole inheritance. Instead, Dad's true children numbered in the hundreds now, every life touched, every chance given, every family chosen. That's the thing about inheritance. The material wealth Matthew craved could be stolen, manipulated, fought over. But the inheritance that mattered, the lessons, the values, the love, that could only be given freely and received with an open heart. Matthew had rejected that inheritance long before he'd poisoned Dad's tea. He'd poisoned himself with jealousy, greed, and the belief that blood was thicker than love. Standing there in the gathering dusk, I felt Dad's presence as clearly as if he stood beside me. Not a ghost, but a legacy made manifest in every choice to help rather than harm, to build rather than tear down, to expand the definition of family rather than guard it jealously. "Thank you," I said to the evening air, "for choosing me, for teaching me to choose others, for showing me that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well, loving freely, and building something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal." The cardinal returned, this time with a mate. They perched together on the birdhouse, and I chose to see it as a sign. Love multiplies when shared. Families grow when hearts open. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance is the chance to become who we were always meant to be. I walked back into the center, where Jennifer was helping serve dinner to the after-school kids. She caught my eye and smiled, David Cooper's granddaughter in every way that mattered. Around us, the building hummed with life, with purpose, with the echoes of a man who understood that true wealth was measured in the families we choose and the love we leave behind. Matthew had taken what he thought was everything, but in the end, he'd left me with the only thing that truly mattered, the knowledge that I was David Cooper's daughter, not by blood, but by choice. His choice, my choice, the choice renewed every day in every action taken to honor his memory and continue his work. And that inheritance, that was priceless. That was eternal. That was mine. Forever and always, because it had been freely given and freely received. The way all the best things in life are meant to be. The story of our family didn't end with Dad's death or Matthew's imprisonment. It continued in every life touched by the foundation. Every building erected with purpose. Every person who learned that family is chosen and love is multiplied when shared. It continued in Jennifer's determination to be better than her biological father, in the employees who became owners, in the community that rallied around Dad's vision. As I locked up the center that night, I paused at the door. A small plaque beside it read, "The David and Margaret Cooper Family Center, where families are chosen, not born." Below it, in smaller letters, "In loving memory of a man who understood that inheritance isn't what you take, but what you give." I touched the plaque gently, then headed home. Not to the big Victorian where I'd grown up. That belonged to the community now. But to my small apartment near the office, where Dad's fishing gear sat in the corner and his books lined the shelves. Where Mom's ring caught the light each morning and reminded me that love comes in many forms. Where I was surrounded not by wealth, but by meaning. Not by blood, but by choice. And in that simple truth, I had everything. Everything that mattered. Everything Dad had wanted me to have. Everything Matthew had never understood was worth having. I was Rachel Cooper, daughter of David and Margaret Cooper. Not by birth, but by love. Not by blood, but by choice. And that made all the difference in the world.